Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another week of our coffee talks. This week's theme is dairy, calf, and cow feeding. Today joining us, we have Amanda Fischer and Juanita Echeverry Munera. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now while I complete my intro and let them set up with sharing their screen. They're both under Dr. Mike Steele, a familiar name to most of us here in Alberta. Amanda focusing on the development of colostrum in the udder, and Juanita on calf milk replacer and how the composition affects calf performance. So today, both of them are going to present to us on how to optimize calf feeding. And following the presentation, there's a Q&A session facilitated by Gesines Martins, producer in Alberta, and Dr. Masahito Oba, professor at U of A, and that will continue on until near 11 o'clock, should the interest present. So with that, I will mute myself, turn off my video, and I will let Amanda and Juanita take over.
Thanks, Jody. Go ahead, Juanita.
Perfect. So hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. As Jody said before, my name is Juanita Echeverry. I'm a PhD student at the University of Guelph under the supervision of Dr. Mike Steele. And just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I completed my undergrad degree at the University of Alberta. In fact, Dr. Oba was one of my professors. And by the time I was at the University of Alberta, I had the opportunity to work with Mike since my second year of undergrad. And then I also had the opportunity to study in the Netherlands for a couple of months and work with trout nutrition, focusing on electrolytes for calves. Then just because 3 years were not enough for me to work with Mike, I decided to do a master's with him. And that's what I just finished it last year. And I'm currently doing my PhD with him as well. So my research focuses on milk replacer composition, but I'll be focusing during my PhD mainly on the dairy beef.
And as Jody said, my name is Amanda Fischer-Touloustos, and thank you for having me today. I started in Dr. Steele's lab in 2015 when I moved to Edmonton to do my master's with him at the University of Alberta. And then I just started my PhD with him in 2020. And as Jody kind of mentioned, my research focuses a lot on colostrum management and colostrum bioactivity. So basically, just like you guys, Juanita and I have endured Mike Steele for many, many years. So hopefully we can do our lab justice in this talk where we're going to talk about how to optimize calf feeding. So first, I just want to give some background on this resurgence in dairy calf research that we've basically seen over the past 20 years. We've really seen publications related to the field of dairy calf nutrition increase drastically from about 1,200 publications in the year 2000 to up to 4,000 publications in the year of 2020. And this year, it looks like we're on track to do the same amount or even more publications since we're already at 800 publications in March of this year. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we see this resurgence in dairy calf research over the last 20 years, when it's also been about 20 years since the concept of early life programming was introduced. So when I talk about early life programming, I like to think about the calf as a ball rolling down a hill. So at the top of the hill, that's when the calf is born. And if she's healthy and managed well, then she goes on to become our ideal phenotype, or our cow that is very productive, efficient, and healthy. But if something happens after the calf is born, let's say her first colostrum feeding is delayed and she has failure of passive transfer, this is going to derail the path that the ball is on and move her further away from that ideal phenotype. And if something else happens, like she gets diarrhea, she has to be treated with antibiotics, and she goes off feed, she's going to move even further away from being that ideal phenotype. She might be less productive when she goes on to be our milking cow. Maybe she has some high incidence of health disorder and she's less efficient. So in terms of lifetime productivity and how early life feeding can influence this, when we talk about colostrum, we know from a decent amount of studies that feeding less colostrum, such as 2 liters instead of 4 liters, can result in a decrease by 200 grams in average daily gain, and also a 12% decrease in survival and a 1,000 kilo decrease in milk through to the second lactation.
And from studies performed evaluating restrictive and ad libitum feeding schemes, we know that restricting animals can result in lower gains during the pre-weaning period. Moreover, other studies have shown that about 1 kilogram of ADG during the pre-weaning period can translate into an increase of more than 1,000 kilograms of milk during the first lactation. So with this knowledge in mind, and the fact that early life nutrition play an important role in lifetime productivity, our lab has 2 overall goals. The first one being how to optimize calf feeding. We want to know how to achieve maximum health, efficiency, and lifetime productivity. And the second goal is that we want to uncover specific compounds, energy substrates, and understand the different mechanisms that modulate changes in the young calf.
So as I mentioned, my research largely focuses on colostrum. That will be my section of the presentation. And then Juanita will focus on the milk feeding in the second half of the presentation. So I'm sure that you guys have heard Mike say before that colostrum is full of many different bioactive compounds. There's way too many for us to get into it in this presentation, but basically these bioactive compounds are present at really high levels in colostrum compared to whole milk. For instance, even if you just look at insulin, its ratio in colostrum to whole milk is about 100:1. But the bioactive compound that we talk about the most is immunoglobulins, or IgG, because this is the bioactive compound that's going to make sure our calves have transfer of passive immunity, which is necessary for ensuring the health and survival of our calves. When we talk about passive transfer of immunity, there are typically 4 key colostrum management factors that we need to focus on. And those are the quality of the colostrum, the quantity of the colostrum that we're going to feed to the calf, the quickness or how fast we're going to feed the colostrum to the calf after she's born, and the cleanliness of the colostrum. So throughout the presentation, Juanita and I are going to pose these questions to you guys, and then we're going to attempt to answer them with our slides. But if you guys want to talk about it any more in the discussion period, we can dive deeper into it then. So the first question that I want to focus on is, what are the consequences of poor colostrum management, and how do you assess passive transfer in your calves on farm? So this is the first study that I did at the University of Alberta at the DRTC during my master's. What we did is we fed calves colostrum either at 0 hours, so right when they were born, or there was a delay in that first colostrum feeding by either 6 hours or by 12 hours. What we saw is that when we fed the calves at 0 hours or right after birth, they had higher concentrations of IgG or higher rates of passive transfer compared to the calves that were fed at 6 and 12 hours. But what we didn't expect is that the calves that weren't fed colostrum until 6 or 12 hours actually didn't fail passive transfer. So failure of passive transfer is basically characterized by IgG that's below this 10 gram per liter line. And as you can see, they're above that line. So they didn't have failure of passive transfer. But we actually published this study in 2018, and this was before the new cutoff categories of passive transfer were established by this basically global team of colostrum experts. And they established 4 different categories, and within each category, there are different risks for illness and death. So those categories are poor, fair, good, or excellent passive transfer. So from this study in 2020, we now know that the calves that were fed at 6 and 12 hours and have IgG concentrations between 10 to 18 grams per liter have a 1.2 times greater risk of illness and a 2.5 times greater risk of mortality compared to our calves that are fed earlier or in that excellent category of passive transfer. So really, when we look at these 2 studies together, it's really just driving home the point that we need to feed our calves colostrum within that 2 to 3 hour window after they're born in order to ensure their health and survival. And since we've covered the quickness of colostrum feeding, now I want to talk about colostrum quality. And typically when we talk about colostrum quality, good quality is characterized as colostrum with a concentration of 50 grams of IgG per liter or greater. And we want to feed about 3 to 4 liters of this colostrum to our calf. So the calf will receive about 150 to 200 grams of IgG in total. And we know that as the quality of the colostrum goes up, so does the passive transfer status of the calves. So you can see here on the left, we have low quality maternal colostrum, so 30 grams per liter, good quality at 60 grams per liter, and very high quality at 90 grams per liter. And you can see the passive transfer status linearly increases. But what one farmer from Alberta, Jeff None, actually encouraged Mike to do was to look at the utility to possibly use colostrum replacer to enhance the quality of low quality colostrum, since he had been doing this on his farm for a couple of years and was seeing a lot of good results. So one of our PhD students, Alberto Lopez, did this. And when he added colostrum replacer to the low quality colostrum, the passive transfer or serum IgG increased by about 8 grams per liter. So we're basically seeing these calves jump from the poor or fair category up to the good category, where they're going to have reduced risk of illness and death. So it's probably worth the investment here. But when we attempted to enrich the good quality or 60 gram per liter maternal colostrum with colostrum replacer in order to bring it up to 90 grams per liter, we didn't really see much benefit. We only saw the IgG increase by about 2 grams per liter. So probably not much bang for your buck to add colostrum replacer into your good quality maternal colostrum. So from this study, we conclude that enriching low quality colostrum with colostrum replacer might be a feasible strategy to ensure passive transfer in your calves. And now that we're talking so much about passive transfer, I think that we should discuss how to assess passive transfer on farm. Typically, this is done using serum total protein with a value of 5.2 grams per deciliter or greater, signifying successful passive transfer. But recently, the same PhD student, Alberto Lopez, wanted to look into whether or not we can use serum total protein only for calves that are fed maternal colostrum, which is well established in the literature, or if we can also use it for calves that are fed colostrum replacer. And when he did this, he basically found a really good relationship between serum total protein and passive transfer in calves that were fed maternal colostrum. Specifically, it only inaccurately characterized 14% of calves as having failure of passive transfer when really they didn't. So this is a low number. So we conclude that you can continue to use STP for calves fed maternal colostrum. But when we looked at calves that were fed colostrum replacer, we actually didn't find a good relationship at all between the serum total protein and the true passive transfer status. Specifically, serum total protein inaccurately characterized 41% of calves as having failure of passive transfer, when in reality, they did not. So from this study, we conclude that serum total protein is not an accurate tool to predict passive transfer status in colostrum replacer fed calves, but you can use this for your calves that are fed maternal colostrum. And I just want to give you guys a little bit more detail about assessing passive transfer on farm. As we all know from my previous slide, you can use serum total protein, or you can also use your Brix refractometer to do this. And I just wanted to include this chart of the new cut point categories and the equivalent serum total protein values or Brix values that you'd get. So if you guys want, you can take a picture of this and you can save it so that when you're on farm and taking these samples, you can see if your calves are in the excellent category or if they're more closer to the fair category. And I also think it's important to mention when we should take these blood samples. Sorry, my cat is around me, but anyways, when we should take these blood samples. And we did a study last year, and what we did is we took blood samples every day after the calf was born. And we found that after about day 4 of life, this serum IgG curve really starts to drop off. So we should probably be taking these samples when the calf is about 1 to 3 days of life, because if we do it any later than day 4, it's really a high probability that we might misclassify our calves as having failure of passive transfer, when in reality, they don't. And the second and last question that I want to pose in the colostrum section is, do you use or have you ever thought about using colostrum beyond the first day of life to potentially enhance calf productivity and health? So we've done a few different studies in this area, and the first one was actually done at the DRTC at the University of Alberta. And the feeding regimen that we used in this study and some other studies in the past couple of years is feeding the calves a 50% colostrum and 50% milk replacer after that initial colostrum feeding on days 2 and 3 of life. What we found is that when we fed this to calves, they had increased intestinal development, their IgG remained elevated after 12 hours of life, and they had a decreased risk of mortality compared to calves that were fed that first colostrum meal and then transitioned directly onto a whole milk diet. And we also did a study last year where we fed extended colostrum replacer for 2 weeks. So basically we fed the calves those initial colostrum replacer meals, and then we fed them a 10% colostrum replacer added on top of a 100% milk replacer diet. And we fed this from days 2 to 14 of life. And these calves had increased body weight, increased average daily gain, and decreased risk of mortality compared to the calves that were fed the initial colostrum meal and then transitioned directly onto whole milk, which we know happens on a lot of different farms. So basically over the next couple of years, we're going to dive deeper into this idea of extended colostrum feeding and looking at the calf level and how these different feeding regimens are possibly enhancing their health and productivity as we're observing.
Perfect. So now that we have a calf that have received the right amount of colostrum at the right time, best quality, the next question is, how are we going to feed this calf from now on? And I know that most of you that have been in many of these webinars have been told all the benefits of a high plane of nutrition versus a low plane of nutrition. And I think we've been talking about this for the past 5 to 10 years. But just so we have it fresh in our mind, I'm going to touch on it just one more time. So this graph that I'm showing here is coming from one study performed by Jen Hazen, that I'm assuming most of you are familiar with her, out of the University of Alberta. So what Jen did is that she compared high versus low feeding schemes in calves that were being fed whole milk. And what we can see is that these calves, the calves that were receiving more milk, had so much more advantage during the first 3 to 4 weeks of life than those in the low planes of nutrition. This is key, especially during this around this time of their life, taking into account that we usually don't see that these calves are consuming a lot of started feed between the first 3 weeks of life. So they're obtaining most of the energy from the milk diet. And this makes me wonder if we're underestimating the capacity of the abomasum around these weeks, and also if we're missing an opportunity to increase the growth early in life when these animals are the most efficient. So having that in mind, and having in mind all the benefits that high volumes of liquid feeds can mean for us on farm, it is unclear whether the current milk replacer formulations are adequate for the levels of milk that we are proposing during the pre-weaning period. So I just want to draw your attention to this graph in the screen, where I am comparing one milk replacer formulation, a formulation that is very similar to those milk replacers that you can find commercially, and we're comparing it with whole milk. And we can find substantial variations between the two, especially regarding the amount of fat and lactose, as well as the energy density of the diets and the fat composition. So these differences have been a result from the lean growth target that the industry has had in heifers especially, and also due to the historical availability of milk byproducts rich in lactose, as well as in ash, such as skim milk and whey. So based on this, you might be asking, what is wrong with giving a little bit more of lactose and less fat? Well, from different studies, we know that calves can tolerate about 10 grams of lactose per kilogram of body weight, which translates to about 7 liters of milk per day, which many of you have been doing this in your farm. However, when we go a little bit over that, we might be compromising certain things in the animal, such as water absorption, and also we might be reducing the ability of the animal to deal with the glucose that's in the system. On the other hand, with the undersupply of fat, we know that fat is crucial for energy supply and for thermal regulation, which becomes very important in countries like Canada in those cold Canadian winters. Also, we know from several other studies that increasing fat might promote gut growth. And from studies done in the United States in big dairies, we've seen that as you decrease fat in the diet, you might increase the risk of mortality in these young animals. In order to understand the effects of increasing fat in milk replacer, and when we try to formulate these milk replacers a little bit closer to that of the biological reference, which is whole milk, this student, she used to be a PhD student at the University of Guelph with Mike Steele, Annemiek Welborn. So what she did is that she fed restricted amounts of milk to calves, being a high fat milk replacer and a high lactose. And what she found out is when she's given more fat to these calves were able to have greater ADG. And after taking into account the feed intake as well as the energy intake of these calves, she found out that the calves in the high fat treatment gain more weight per unit of energy. And taking this into a more practical perspective, these animals were meeting their energy requirements for maintenance sooner, and thus leaving more energy available for growth. But now, what happens when we take this into an ad libitum setup? In this study, I performed it at the Calf and Beef Research Center in the Netherlands at Trout Nutrition. And what we did is that we fed the calves either a high-fat milk replacer or a high-lactose milk replacer, a very similar composition to that what Annemiek used in her study. And we found that when we given high-lactose milk replacers, the calves were able to drink up to 3 liters more than the high-fat calves. However, we didn't see a negative effect on solid feed intake. And when we look at the metabolizable energy intake, we also didn't see a difference between the two. This suggests that the calves were consuming the milk replacer based on the caloric density of the diet, and the calves and the high-fat treatment were able to meet those energy requirements with less food. In the same study, we also saw some differences in IDG, especially during the 3rd week of life, when we saw that the animals consuming the high lactose were growing a little bit more than the high fat. However, when we looked at the whole period, the whole experimental period, and taking into account the solid feed that they were eating, we didn't see a difference on growth at all. However, what's more interesting on this study is that we find out that through different diets, and we can target different feeding behaviors. And we observed that when we increase the fat level in these milk replacers, we saw about a 41% decrease in unrewarded visits to the milk station. And in the literature, these unrewarded visits have been known to be hunger-related behaviors, which are a welfare concern, especially during the weaning period. So these findings give us an idea that we need to explore a little bit more other formulations and thinking outside of what's considered traditional, since we might be missing some additional benefits for these calves and for the productivity of our farms.
So now I just want to focus on the take-home messages for our presentation. For the colostrum section, I talked about that we need to be cautious or not use serum total protein to assess passive transfer in calves that are fed colostrum replacer, and that we also should be assessing our calves for passive transfer of immunity from days 1 to 3 of life. I also touched on the potential of enriching low-quality colostrum with colostrum replacer in order to improve passive transfer, as well as the idea of extending colostrum feeding up to 2 weeks of life to have benefits on calf productivity and health. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about some future research directions or some research areas that I'm currently focusing on, but I didn't have time to add into the presentation. So I focus a lot on bioactive compounds in colostrum and transition milk aside from IgG. We actually did an experiment at Breevely Farms, the DeGui's farm in Wetaskiwin in 2017. And we published about 5 papers, I think, on all of the different bioactive compounds. And we've just been building on that data set to really try and add more value to that colostrum and transition milk. And my PhD research also focuses a lot on how to improve colostrum quality at the dam level. Specifically, I look at different prepartum nutrition and how this might affect colostrum quality and the bioactive compounds in there.
And for the milk feeding, some of the take-home messages is that the milk feeding levels currently applied in the industry might not reflect the volumes that will be voluntarily consumed by these young animals. Also, that by increasing the planes of nutrition, we also encounter the question of whether current milk replacer formulations are optimal to what we're proposing. And the last one is that the high dietary inclusion of fat might have benefits to the young calf that we maybe don't understand so well at the moment, or that we're not aware of them just yet. And for the future research direction, especially in the milk feedings, we would like to investigate the fatty acid composition and alternative energy sources, especially for fat, for milk replacers. So one of our colleagues and lab members, Juliet Wilms, is currently spending a lot of time on this topic. So we're hoping to get a lot of information in this area that we can in the future share with you. Also, we would like to evaluate or have a better understanding of the long-term effects of early nutrition with new milk replacer compositions. And something that I think very personal is how we can apply this knowledge to improve management practices for surplus calves, not only for the heifer that is not going to join your milking herd, but also to the male calf. And this is something that I will be focusing a lot more for the next 3 to 4 years during my PhD. Lastly, we would like to conclude by saying that we need to keep in mind that early life nutrition and management matters, and that it can have a big impact on the lifetime productivity. Also, let's not forget that we are responsible for them, and that we should all continue working together, making sure that we are providing these calves with the best care that's ensuring excellent welfare, more profitable animals, and also a more sustainable industry. And with that, we would like to say thank you, everybody, for being here, for sticking around. Thank you to Alberta Milk for giving us this space in this platform to reach out to producers and share what we've been doing the past few years in the lab. Also to the Steel Lab for putting all the time and effort into these studies and just providing so much great knowledge. And also, I would like to say that as much as we do a lot of Mike's approved jokes, we are very thankful for the support he provides, and we're also very lucky to be working with him for all these years. And lastly, I would like to say thank you to all the university, the industry that has been involved in these studies, that really they're making this getting this knowledge possible. And well, I could say thank you at last.
Juanita, Amanda, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation this morning. I know it's already started stimulating some questions and dialogue. While our facilitators are turning on their screens, I'll just throw out one that was thrown in the chat, and I think it was Juanita during your session. Can you define the percentage of what makes it high fat? I think the question is that above 4%.
Yeah, so in both studies, we used diets that we did a 6% weight-to-weight exchange. So we ended up replacing 6% of lactose by 6% of fat. So in total, if I'm not mistaken, we were feeding 26% fat, if I'm not mistaken, but I can double check those numbers.
Sure, and I will let the respondent ask further questions in the Q&A. I will again introduce, we have Gesines Martins and Dr. Masahiro Oba as our facilitators today. And I will sneak out of here until we get close to the hour and let them facilitate what I'm assuming is going to be a very interesting discussion. So thank you, Masahiro. Thank you, Gesines, for joining us.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. They asked me to introduce myself first. My name is Gesines Martins. I'm involved with Alberta Milk on the board, but also with the research committee. And I always have loved that work because I think our industry has to be innovative, because that's how you drive an industry forward. If there's nothing new, we do the same thing. There's no innovation going on. Our family dairy is at Kalmar. That's just a little bit west of the Edmonton airport. We milk about 300 cows on average. We're raising our own calves. We have mostly about 30, 40 calves on whole milk. We're using the milk shuttle. So it can pasteurize, but we actually not doing. We're saving the morning milk and feed it in the afternoon. And the afternoon milk, what comes from the robots, that is what we're feeding in the morning. And it's got heated up between 38 and 40 degrees Celsius. We're feeding mostly about 6 liters a day per calf in 2 feedings. We're introducing the calf starter about on 2 weeks of age. And if they're about 4 or 5 weeks, we start grouping them so that they have more social contact. And if they're weaned, it's mostly at 8 till 9 months. And then they get dehorned, vaccinated, and then they go to a heifer raiser, because we don't have any facilities at our place to raise our own heifers. So Masahiro, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Gesines. My name is Masahiro Oba. I'm a professor of dairy nutrition at University of Alberta. Well, I am involved in a research project in calf nutrition directly and indirectly. It's a kind of area of, interest, because we have many, new information generated from recent research. And as a researcher, I am interested in the quality of colostrum and transition milk, in addition to immunoglobulin. There are many bioactive compounds in colostrum and transition milk, and how we can get advantage of that. And another question, area I'm interested in is the optimum fat content in the milk replacer. So I think both Amanda and Juanita, cover the base very well. So I, really look forward to discussion for next 30 minutes. Then I got some question from producers. Maybe I can start with 2 questions. Tom asked question, maybe for Amanda. What is the lowest quality of colostrum you would add colostrum replacer to? He used Brix method for testing. How would you answer that?
The lowest quality, or else you should just throw it away. I assume that's what he means. So in that study, we used 30 grams per liter, but there's actually some apps that are out from different colostrum replacer groups, and you can put in the bricks of your current colostrum, maternal colostrum, and then they'll tell you how much colostrum replacer to add. But just thinking from experience, I don't think we should be adding probably more than 600 grams or 700 grams of colostrum replacer to that maternal colostrum, because you're going to really up the total solids. And I don't think that we have enough research knowing how that's going to affect the calf. So the lowest bricks, yeah, it would depend. I'd say maybe 20 grams per liter. So Brix of like 16 or 15. Yeah, that's probably the lowest I would go. If not, you should probably just feed a full colostrum replacer meal or something you have in the freezer, high quality.
So please, if you have any question, please click Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and your question will be displayed, and yeah, we can ask questions. Maybe I'll ask one more question from Martin. Do you use nipple feeding?
Sorry, for me or Juanita?
Maybe Amanda, I think.
For colostrum feeding?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can feed with a bottle or esophageal tube feeder. We actually did a study at Brievely in 2016, I think, and we found that there were no differences in passive transfer rates if we bottle fed or tube fed the calves. That being said, if your calves don't want to consume like the whole 3 or 4 liter meal of colostrum, you can tube, if they only want to consume 2 liters, I'd say tube that last liter if you need to, because it's just the most important that we get it into them as early as we can. So yeah, I think you can use either method, whatever works best for you on farm.
Okay, Juanita, do you have any additional comment for later stage?
No, I think I agree with Amanda, and similar when it comes to milk feeding, whether if you're using a nipple or if you just feed in bucket, I think that the most important thing is to get this milk in these calves. And in studies, we haven't seen really a difference in the animals when you use whether a nipple bucket, a bottle, or a bucket without any nipples at all. And I know a lot of people were scared of maybe feeding the milk in just a bucket and ending up as ruminal drinkers. But I think the chances are very low. I've seen studies in veal calves and they only report about 1 to 2% of the calves ending up as ruminal drinkers. So I think the most important thing is that we're feeding the animals properly, and yeah.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, so Gazinas, could you take care of next few questions? There are some in the chat box.
Yeah, thank you, Masahiro. I was just on the chat. Dineke Philipson had a question. And that's actually on feeding on the dry cows, so probably Amanda, because that is her future research more, I guess. We feed Exolite to the dry cows, and then they give hardly any colostrum first couple of milkings. What do you think the quality is for later milking, say the 3rd and 4th time?
Sorry, what is the product? Does anyone know?
Exolite.
So what does that, I'm not
Exolite
familiar.
is an add-on to kind of a dry cow mineral, and it has to do with binding the calcium.
Okay, so you're not getting a lot of colostrum from doing that. I haven't read any studies about that, so I'm not sure. But if you're not getting a lot of colostrum, like a lot of colostrum volume from the beginning, that also might reduce the quality of your transition milk, because the whole idea behind transition milk is that colostrum is still kind of lingering and it's still there before it's fully diluted by whole milk. So yeah, I'm not sure specifically how it would affect it, but if you're already having trouble with the colostrum volume, it's probably going to also affect your transition milk.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Our farm is feeding that Exolite as well as dry cows, and we don't have the really low colostrum volume actually. So I don't think it's the Exolite what triggers that. I think that it has to do more with the protein levels what you feed to your dry cows. Masahito, do you know more about that to add on?
Actually, I cannot think of any mechanism that the Exolite cause low colostrum production. So I think it's just a matter of coincidence, I believe, because I cannot think of any physiological mechanism from a researcher perspective. So maybe something else might cause that.
Yeah, and in terms of like Gazinos mentioned prepartum protein, something else that can affect colostrum too is like your prepartum starch. So maybe you need to reevaluate your prepartum diets with your nutritionist to see if there's a way you can optimize it so you're getting a good amount of colostrum.
Hey, thanks, Amanda. I think that's a really good tip. I go to the next one. Actually, that's a comment from Anna Marika. A question that came up in a previous survey. How much milk per day do you recommend feeding calves, specified by weeks until weaning? And I got a follow-up for that one as well.
Yeah, so personally, I'm a big believer of allowing the calves to drink as much as they would like. And I know this sometimes cannot be feasible on farm. So I'm a big advocate of having accelerated feeding schemes, so high feeding schemes in these calves. I know in previous studies, we've performed a step up, step down weaning, our feeding scheme, that we start the calves in about 6 liters of milk a day. Then we go up to 8 liters of milk until about week 6 or 7 of life. And then we have a 2-week step down weaning. But keeping in mind that during these first weeks of life, the animals don't really consume much starter feed, I would recommend to put as much milk as we can straight up from the beginning. So even if you want to go from a high blend of nutrition, say 8 liters a day for the first 6 to 7 weeks of life, and then doing a step down weaning, just going down by 25% for the next week, and then to 50% the next week, and next week, and maybe having about a 2 window period for the weaning of these calves, which I think once we're talking about high planes of nutrition comes in very important to have a solid structure for that weaning strategy that you are implementing in your farm, just so we're not losing that advantage of weight that we're winning with enhanced feeding during the pre-weaning, and then maybe not having a not so good transition and then losing that weight post-weaning. So I would recommend high allowance, as I said, about 6 to 8 liters a day for the first, if you want to do the step up, step down, I would recommend 6 liters, then 8 liters, and then do a step down weaning. Otherwise, I will go with 8 liters straight out from the beginning, just to start this calf strong.
Thank you, Juanita. In your presentation, you mentioned that as well. Like, I think the industry average is probably 4 till 5 liters a day, and the high volume is 8 till 10, you stated. My follow-up question there is, if you have these high volume milk deliveries, probably in 2 or 3 portions a day, or maybe an automated calf feeder, but what about the solids? If you feed 10 liters milk to a calf and she's 3 weeks old, I think, is there going to be any intake of calf starter? Because these calves are so full, they are satisfied already. They maybe delay calf starter or have a grower intake. What is your comment about that? And then I go back to Masahito to take some Q&As.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And we've seen that in the research farms as well, that when we're pushing so much milk through these animals, we see that indeed there is a delay in how much solids they're consuming. I didn't present it in this meeting, in this presentation, but we also did another study where we give high planes of nutrition with high fat and high lactose. And we were feeding these calves 8 to 10 liters a day. And then even in restricting setups, we didn't see an effect on solid feed intake. I will assume or expect a delay in when the calves are starting to eat that started. And that's why I think it's so important to have a solid weaning transition period and allowing those calves to, as you're decreasing the energy from the milk, that they can start matching the energy that they were consuming before the weaning through the solid feed. And sometimes I think it's not very feasible on farm maybe, but we talk about 2 to 3 weeks weaning and just allowing these calves to be able to match that up so we don't see a big weaning dip as we can see in some animals that are being weaned more abruptly. But definitely, I agree with you that solid intake can be a little bit of a concern. But if they're not consuming a lot of started in the first 3 weeks, might as well giving them as much energy as we can through the milk and ensuring that we're taking advantage of that efficiency that the animals have in the first weeks of life, for sure.
May I also add to what Juanita said too? If you're going to feed an early or a high plane of nutrition early on, the key is that you're going to wean later. If you're going to wean at like 4 weeks or 5 weeks, that's too early. And the calf, especially if she's on those high planes of nutrition, like Gesine said, she's not going to have a lot of starter intake. You have to do that step down program and let her reach the proper age where her rumen is developed to start consuming that starter. So yeah, one of the keys to making a successful high plane nutrition program is weaning later on, ideally within 6 to 8 weeks or closer to 8 weeks.
Thank you. Okay, I got another question, maybe toward the Amanda, regarding serum total protein. Okay, comparing calves given colostrum at 3 hours after the birth, with those get colostrum 12 hours after the birth. Is there any like a research that early colostrum feeding have better serum total protein?
That's a good question. And I think that what might affect it would be like the dehydration of the calves if they're going that long gap of not being fed colostrum. I don't know if there's any specific research looking at how the dehydration affects serum total protein, but even from my study that we did during my master's that I presented, we looked at the serum total protein. And of course, it was lower in the calves that were fed at 12 hours compared to those fed earlier. But there isn't a lot of research on how dehydration or withholding a meal is actually going to influence serum total protein. But I would assume that it would, because you're going to get more concentrated. If anything, you're actually going to reduce the blood volume, and it's going to look like your calves might have passive transfer when in reality, they don't if you're withholding that meal for too long.
If I may ask, add something to what Amanda just said. I think I agree with her answer, and it's something that we've seen in calves that have been transported for long periods of time once they're dehydrated, and we try to evaluate the dehydration levels. We've seen that the total serum protein usually it's elevated due to the little plasma content that is in the blood at the moment for the liquid. So I think you will expect animals to have a greater, but maybe they're not. So it can be like a biased answer.
Okay, thank you. So while we are waiting for some more questions to come up, I like to ask my own question to take advantage of as a facilitator about pasteurization of colostrum. There are some research showing that pasteurizing colostrum increase the absorption of immunoglobulin, but at the same time, pasteurization, heat application potentially degrades, break down some, bioactive compound in the colostrum. So maybe I have a question to student, Amanda and Juanita. What do you think? And also I'd like to ask this question to Gesinas or, dairy producers. Are you really practicing, pasteurizing colostrum on the farm?
In terms of how it can affect passive transfer, as you mentioned, there's like some thought that if there's a lot of bacteria in the colostrum, by pasteurizing it, you're reducing that and it can't interfere with the absorption of the IgG. I think that pasteurizing is great. Obviously, when you pasteurize, you're going to lose some of the active cells that are in there. Some proteins might be denatured, but it is really getting rid of that contamination factor. But that being said, if you don't have a pasteurizer and you have no other choice, as long as you're following really good hygiene practices with your bottles and all of your cleaning, I think it can be done. And something else that you can do too is actually have your vet like routinely test your feeding equipment and send it off for culture to make sure there's no bacterial overgrowth, to make sure your cleaning protocols are good. So I see the good in pasteurization and also not, because for some people it's not feasible, but I do like pasteurization. Juanita, do you have any comments?
No, I agree with you. And I think the only comment that I will have is, again, I don't have much experience when it comes to colostrum and pasteurization of colostrum, but I believe that I'd rather sacrifice certain goodies in the colostrum than having to deal with diseases in calves and things that can compromise things later on in life for these animals, and also the performance in like the lifetime performance, really.
Yeah, Gesine, are you pasteurizing colostrum? Do you have any comment as a dairy producer? And also, can you take additional question after you comment? Oh, Gesine, you are muted.
We have the opportunity to pasteurize, but we don't pasteurize actually anything. We're feeding whole milk, we don't pasteurize it. I explained already that we are feeding the afternoon milk from the morning milking. So it's not really sour, but the components are changing. And we found, I learned that actually from another dairy producer who did this already for many years. And you have way less scours. We have hardly any scours in our farm. And I think it has to do, same if you eat yogurt or milk. You can eat more yogurt than drink milk before your stomach gets upset. Mm-hmm. You know, like there is something to it. I don't know what it exactly is. Maybe that's something for research to do as well, you know?
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think too, if you're not pasteurizing and you're not having any disease incidents, then there's no point in changing what you're doing. Yeah.
Okay, there is Jody put something in the chat here. For both of you, have you any recommendations on the better strategies they have seen or heard for producers without automated feeders to implement more calf feedings per day to achieve the higher volume feeding while without increasing the number of farm staff needed? Perhaps there are attendees that would offer their successes through the chat. So if someone does that, multiple feedings and not with an automated feeding, and yeah, Jody is right about it, you know, it takes extra labor. At our place, my wife is feeding twice a day, but she doesn't like to come for third time to the barn, I think, to do another hour and a half, 2 hours feeding. Maybe one of the researchers can also elaborate about water. At our farm, we feed water twice a day, fresh water, to the calves as well. So you feed milk first, and then you do a second round, and then you give the water and add or bring new pellet as well with the 2 pails in front of it. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that. On what age do they need additional water and how important it is?
Juanita, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. Yeah. So just to answer the first question, where they were saying if there is not the possibility to have extra labor, or just the wife doesn't want to spend an extra hour feeding the calves, for example, I think I would recommend that if you want to increase how much we're feeding these animals, you can increase the amounts that you're providing per meal. And I know, and I've heard from other producers that sometimes they're scared of giving too much milk in a meal because they're going to go into ruminal drinkers, or they're going to run into problems with the gastrointestinal tract. However, we've done several studies and we've seen that the calf can consume without any problems about 5 liters of milk. So I think that if the target is to go, for example, from 8 to 10 liters a day, we can increase that extra liter in a meal in case there is not a possibility of going for an extra hour to the barn or having an automatic feeder, because we'll know they can be quite expensive and all sort of things. When it comes to the water, I'm a big believer to just offer water since day one to these calves. I'm not sure in practice if this is done. But I've seen cows being able to drink milk, water outside the milk feedings that we're providing them, and just put themselves in the perspective of the calf that we're being fed one meal and then not being able to drink anything for the next 12 hours or having access to it, especially in the summer or when the conditions are not optimal. I think it would be nice to just have a bucket of water around and just change it every day if possible. But fresh water, I think, is crucial for these calves. And in a sense, and also like how we talk about mature cows, that if you see them drinking water, more likely you'll see them consuming some feed. So it's possible that these two can go hand to hand.
Yeah, I agree with everything Juanita said. And like Gesine said, they change the water twice a day, make sure it's fresh. I think that that's like one of the key management strategies for water, just making sure it's fresh and it's clean, because just like you wouldn't want to drink gross, dirty, old water, neither do the calves. So.
Okay, maybe I have another question, maybe more for the Juanita, regarding the optimum fat content in milk replacer. Like a cow produce milk, with fat content 30% or maybe 35% on dry matter basis, but standard milk replacer contain only 20%. Some milk replacer contain even less, 15%. But, I think it depends on the management or strategy. But can you comment on, like optimum fat content milk replacer and what affect that value?
Yeah, so like, if you ask me and I were to answer from my heart, I will see the optimal would be what we find in milk, because, it's the biological reference that we have. However, I think we still need to do quite a bit of research when it comes to fat inclusion in diets and what it could do to the animal, because we've seen that, for example, in one of my studies that we had an inclusion of 23%, we've seen improvements in the behavior of the animals around the feeding behavior, I mean. And a colleague of ours also have seen improvement in the fecal consistency of, or like the decrease of scours incidence in calves that are being fed more fat, about 23%. So we can see an improvement in the health. Whether this is linked to the high fat addition in the diet is still up to debate, I think, and we still need to do more research on it. Another thing and the reason why I cannot answer for sure what's the optimal number is because I think we haven't figured out what's the optimal fat for the milk replacer. I think there's still a lot of research to be done in this area, and I'm very glad that Juliet Wilms is doing it in this moment, because we still, at the moment, we're putting in these milk replacers vegetable oils. And when we look at the fatty acid composition compared to buttered fat, for example, we see a lot of differences, especially in those short chain fatty acids. So we still need to figure out what will be the best replacement in a milk replacer, and then evaluate what will be the optimal inclusion in those milk replacers to get to the point that we want in these calves. So if you ask me maybe in a couple more years, I will give you a number. But as for now, I think that we could increase a little bit the fat. However, we cannot forget the other components, because now we also have to adjust for protein or lactose. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question, but that's my point of view.
Amanda, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's definitely not my realm of expertise. So she covered it all.
Great. So, Gesine, do you have, we have, few minutes left. Do you have final comments or questions?
Yeah, there was a comment here in the chat from Jody, and I think it goes to Amanda because this is the early calf. Is there any benefit for feeding multiple times colostrum instead of the first feeding colostrum and swap to whole milk or milk replacer?
Yeah.
Can you comment on that one?
Yeah, so obviously that first meal is the most important, but we did a study, I believe it was one we did at the University of Alberta, and we found that when you feed that second colostrum meal, the calves are actually still able to absorb some IgG. And so they're still, it's basically furthering their passive transfer even more. So if you are going to feed that first meal of like 3 to 4 liters, the calf is probably going to be pretty full after that. So even if at 12 hours, you can offer a 2-liter colostrum meal if you have it, that's amazing. And it's just going to make the calf even more healthy and have better passive transfer.
I just want to add something there to Amanda as well. And there's there've been other studies that have come, if I'm not mistaken, from New Zealand group, and they've shown that sometimes some of these bioactive factors that we find in colostrum can also improve gut development, even when we feeding them as a transition milk for the following 2 or 3 meals after the colostrum. Whether this extra development of the gut is beneficial or not, or if we want it, I think there's still a lot of room for investigation in that area. But I think that if we can do anything in order to go more to what nature does and being able to allow the calf to maybe have that transition, maybe it will be a smoother transition when we're maybe putting a little bit of colostrum in the milk replacer or in the subsequent meals, whether that is whole milk or a milk replacer, instead of going colostrum and then straight up to a milk replacer. I think that it's not ideal to go from one to the other right away, but I think there is a lot to learn in that area, I think.
I agree.
Thank you, Juanita. We're almost at our full hour, so back to Jody. Thanks.
Yes. No, I just want to thank Juanita and Amanda again for sharing all of your knowledge with everyone today, for Masahito and Gesines facilitating such a wonderful Q&A session. Calf feeding remains to be one of the most interested topics for Alberta dairy producers, and that.
I think I'm just going to jump in here because it seems that I thought it was my internet, but it seems that Jody's internet is struggling.
She's frozen.
Right, everyone can hear me fine, and okay, good. Well, anyway, I don't know, this has never happened, but apologies for that. Thank you, everyone. I think that was a very nice conversation and Q&A period. Thank you so much, Juanita and Amanda, for sharing your knowledge on this, and for Masahito and Gesines for also sharing your perspectives and to really guide this Q&A and conversation periods so well. I was just going to say that for tomorrow and on Thursday, we will have more coffee talks. Tomorrow is about transition feeding, and on Thursday it is about feeding in AMS systems. So 2 very interesting talks left of this coffee webinar series. And with that, I would like to thank you all again, but also all the attendees for all their questions. And one thing is that I still wanted to mention is that, because we've gotten some questions around that, that we will send everyone that registered for this talk the recordings of this week. And we also have a survey that we send out after, you will see it after the Zoom meeting ends. And we would really appreciate if everyone, all the attendees at least, could fill out the survey, because it really helps us to improve this webinar series. And with that, I hope you all have a great day, and hope to see many of you tomorrow again.